me now great pleasure to welcome our second speaker, and that's Faye Sayers. Faye is a supervising solicitor as well as a tutor at ULaw's Leeds campus. And she'll be discussing supporting people of all ages, backgrounds and ethnicity with legal advice if they come into contact with mental health services, and ensuring those who do know their rights. So welcome, Faye.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you, Sonny. That was really interesting, actually, particularly some of them tips. I think we can all resonate with many of them and just take that on board. So thank you, Sonny. I really enjoyed that. So Patrick has already said, so my name is Faye Sayers. I'm going to be talking this evening about advocating for people with mental disorders. I am a solicitor. I'm a mental health solicitor, and I have undertaken that job for around 10 years now. It may be something that some of you are considering, either you would like to support people who have mental health or are detained under the Mental Health or Mental Capacity Act. It may be something that you've come across before, mental health solicitor. However, generally, when I tell people what my job is, they appear to be completely and utterly shocked. They do not realise that there is such a thing as a mental health solicitor, and nor do they realise, how important it is and how common mental health actually is, and the type of job that's involved in being a mental health solicitor. So hopefully I can sort of give you a little bit of background as to what's involved, what my job is, and just some experiences that I've had and some experiences that have changed me. I was someone who has changed over this 10-year period, meeting people under the Mental Health Act. And I actually think it's a really, really important job that I do. I don't mean to big myself up there. And what any solicitor does who represents people under the Mental Health or Mental Capacity Act. Especially in these current times with COVID, we have all struggled, I'm sure, with our mental health. I know when I heard about the second lockdown, I just felt absolutely just distraught. I'm such an outdoor person, and the idea of staying in my house with a toddler just brought every fear, anxiety, panic into me. I couldn't bear that thought of it. And I just said to my colleagues that day, I said, I'm just going to have to take the day off because I need some time. I need some space to process this. And, it's not just the lockdown. That's limited access to family, support networks, young people not knowing what's going to happen with your exams, lack of opportunities job-wise. I work in pro bono at the University of Law, so lack of opportunities for people who want to be lawyers doing shadowing. So it was a big shock that, and I'm sure a lot of us really felt that at the time. And that's why, as mental health solicitors or advocates or anyone who wishes to promote and let people know about mental health, is we need to let them know about their human rights. And this is really, it sort of gets into when people are sectioned or when they become unwell and need to go into hospital. So your liberty being taken away, and people being offered legal protection. I would also say it's one of the most enjoyable jobs that you could do. I get to meet so many interesting people on a day-to-day basis. I get to travel around to different hospitals, and I meet individuals from all backgrounds, all circumstances. Everyone has a story to tell, and I learn so much from people. So I learn even things about SpongeBob SquarePants from somebody perhaps who's got autism and wants to tell me a little bit about that background. So I sit and I listen. So what does my job as a mental health solicitor involve? In the main, it's representing people who are detained under the Mental Health Act. So there are different sections that can be in place. So there is an assessment section, which is for section 2, it's called, and that's for up to 28 days. And that's for assessment and or treatment. And that's considered a short section. There are also longer term sections known as treatment sections. Generally, there's what's called a Section 3, if you've ever heard that term, and they can last for a bit longer, up to 6 months, although for some people it can be considerably longer than that. And there are also court-imposed sections, so I'm not going to go too much into that today, but I think sort of one of the aspects that sort of really shocks me is the way that the media or film deal with mental disorders, and they often focus on that criminal element of being sectioned, which for me is just completely incorrect. Yes, there are people who are dealt with by the courts and they get detained under the Mental Health Act, and for good reason as well. But the Mental Health Act is used for everyday people who are going through a hard time, have long-standing mental health disorder, or they just need some support, assistance and detention for a short period in their life while they come to get a diagnosis, get the right treatment. What most shocked me when I started this job was the different people I would meet. Again, it's that media, public perception. It's just the same type of people who have mental disorders. And I know Sonia said this as well. It's not. It can be anybody. So I have represented doctors, I've represented solicitors, students, I've represented new mothers on mother and baby units, which is quite an unusual situation. You go onto the unit and somebody is there who has been sectioned, who has recently given birth. Shop workers, people who are unemployed, postmen, postwomen, husbands, wives, children, grandparents. And what I'm really trying to say is that this person could be anyone, your friends, your family. And let's show some compassion and understanding when someone is struggling and they were trying to reach out. And again, Sonia sort of mentioned this, it might not be they're directly reaching out to you. It could be an indirect thing. Has somebody's behavior changed? Are they acting a bit different? Are they not coming out as often? Do they not wish to speak to you? Are they eating differently or not eating at all? So can we try to recognize some of them triggers and see when someone is struggling, because they might not always tell you. Before someone is sectioned under the Mental Health Act, consideration must always be given to a less restrictive alternative. Could they be managed at home? What support is available from community mental health teams? So I've spoken a little bit about family, but there are also services that have to be involved as well. Have they been explored? Have we looked at the least restrictive option? And that's something as a solicitor I always look at. Why is this person's liberty being taken away? I look at the section papers and I look at what alternatives have been considered. So if you do go into this area of law, that's something that you want to look at, what has been considered for that person before we've looked at that last resort of going into hospital. And it is true, some people do need to go into hospital and they need to get that support and help at that time. Something else I like to look at is cultural differences. So if somebody has been sectioned and they're talking about witches or they're very spiritual, I try to look at their background. What country were they born in? What are their family views? Have they come over to this country as a refugee and suffered a lot of hurt and really trauma in their own countries? Has somebody held spiritual beliefs for the past 15 years and never required detention in a mental health hospital? What has changed now? Is it just that they've got a new neighbour who's moved in next door and they found it unusual? Or is it because they've become much more unusual in their thinking and they're acting on that thinking and doing certain behaviours which put them at risk to themselves or others? So why have they suddenly required hospital admission? And again, this is something that you can look at with your friends and family. Has somebody's behaviour changed? And what is normal anyway? So we all have our little quirms. So just look if someone has changed to their normal behaviour. Okay, so these are really important considerations that we need to look at for people. There is of course, a legal procedure in place for when someone is sectioned, and they must be seen by 2 medical members and somebody who is called an approved mental health professional, or an AMP, AMHP. They tend to have a background in social work or that side of things. And going into mental hospitals can be immensely stressful. It can be frightening. Those who work in them through no fault of their own obviously become accustomed to them. I do that myself. I've been in that many hospitals that it sort of becomes second nature now. But for somebody who has never been in hospital before, let's consider how they might feel. There are rules in hospital, and ultimately, the scariest part is having your liberty taken away. It can be distressing, but also please be assured that staff are there to support people, to try and help them. They are nursing staff, they're very caring, and they will try and help you understand what is going on. At hospitals, you are allowed a mental health solicitor. You have the right to that solicitor, and generally that is free of charge. And they can advise you, and they come and meet with you on the ward. Obviously, during this COVID period, that has been restricted and legal visits have been over the telephone. However, it is hoped that soon legal visits can start up again face to face. For me, it's really important that somebody gets the chance to see a solicitor so they can speak to them in confidence. What is said in that meeting is confidential. So there's an ethical point there, again, for those people who are interested in going into mental health law or advocating for people. The only exception is when a solicitor deems that imminent harm to that person or somebody else. That's the only reason that confidentiality could be breached. But generally what is said is everything in confidence. And sometimes people don't always want to speak to their family member. They don't want to speak to someone on the ward who's caring for them because they are scared as to what might happen. And they really want to know what their legal rights are. So the solicitor will explain your legal rights, explain having access to family, friends, mobile phone, always the big one. Can I have my mobile phone? And also appeal to a tribunal. They will also look through someone's medical notes, which again seems a bit out of the norm, a bit strange for a solicitor to look at your medical notes, but that is something, again, that we can do with the person's permission. Why is it important, and why am I even talking about it now? So we need to make sure people's voices are heard, particularly those who cannot advocate for themselves. There is a legal argument, and although individuals, can generally advocate a lot for themselves, sometimes it's easier to do with the help and assistance of a solicitor. I often find I'm a bit more of a counsellor when I sit with my clients. I will sit and listen to them and listen to the reasons why they feel they've been brought into hospital and why they feel they do not need to be there. As a solicitor, we also need to ensure that facts are not misinterpreted. I'll give an example. I had a client, long-standing client I represented for, pretty much all my career in mental health. And he'd been in the army, and he was also a Thai boxer. Every time he was sectioned, he was deemed as being aggressive because he was tall, he was obviously strong. And he was quite loud as well. That was just his personality and his nature. In my opinion, he was a real pussycat. I really liked him, and I genuinely had a pleasure of representing him for a number of years. I got to know the person and not just what was written in the papers. So, how people saw him, or what was written in his papers, or he was in the army, he was a Thai boxer, that makes out that someone's quite aggressive. However, I really got to know him, his background, his admissions to hospital. I'd been to his home, to his flat, and he trusted me. And this was somebody I think I was about 8.5 months pregnant. I went to his flat. I wouldn't do that if somebody was aggressive and horrible, but I knew him. I knew him really well. And I knew what was written in and the papers wasn't right. And he was very sweet. When I got to his flat when I was pregnant, he'd bought me a milkshake to make sure that me and the baby were okay. So he was just a very sweet, nice person. And it became a privilege actually to represent him. And he relied on me, he trusted in me. And that was the biggest privilege, for somebody to trust in you, who is not a family member, not a friend, but they trust you. He had a lovely sense of humour, and he had had a bad history, suffered from PTSD and bipolar, but was genuinely a good person. I've also represented young people who have struggled with exam pressure and developed eating disorders or significant self-harm. I'd worked with families and also the young people to ensure they receive the right treatment. And at times I would need to challenge decisions made by the hospitals using independent evidence. I think for me, and how I've developed over these past 10 years, is to never judge someone. We all have different experiences in our lives. We've developed as people. We deal with stress in different ways, and we deal with life and work in different ways. Some people have traumatic childhoods, and some people use self-harm as coping mechanisms. We are all very different, and that's what makes us human, and that for me makes us interesting and good people. So what have I learned? I've learned that I need to stand up for people with mental health, and that mental health is so important. I am lucky in that I can help people who are struggling, and although I don't always get to see the end result, I occasionally do see my clients in the community, and when I do, I can smile, and when they come and tell me that they're doing really well, it just really makes me feel great. So let's try and get rid of the stigma. Realize that mental health is normal. It can happen to anyone. We all experience in some form of our lives through our families, our friends, work colleagues. Some of you, as I mentioned, may wish to go into mental health law as a specialism. It is a rewarding career for those that work in it. So thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of the talks this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faye, and you're absolutely right to big up yourself. I think it's really important. I've never heard of a mental health solicitor before I met you, so it's really interesting listening to what you've had to say. I think one of the key things that I picked up was around that listening. It's not just listening, it's sort of how important that listening is for individuals, and recognizing that anyone can struggle and not to judge them, and looking in terms of trying to recognize some of those triggers. And I think this may be something that we may want to come back to in the Q&A session. So certainly if you've got any questions around that, it'll be good to mention that in the chat, and we can pick up on it in the Q&A session. But thank you so much, Faye.